You're in the show. The broadcast is live. Okay. Now, seeing the presence of a quorum, I'll call to order the Budget Subcommittee of the Amherst Pelham Regional School Committee. When I say your name, please respond that you're present. Heather.
Board present.
Carrie.
Present.
Allison.
Present.
Oh, so question, since you're not actually on the committee, should I be asking you if you're present? Does anybody know? Okay, well, I just did.
It's a good test of the system.
Yeah.
Not officially required. But.
Okay, all right. And Stans are present. So Dr. Slaughter sent us an agenda, and the first order of business is to approve minutes.
If I only had gotten them done. So I was hoping to find my notes from the last time we met, which was back in January, and I didn't get a chance to do that, so we don't have any minutes. Sorry. Okay,
that's okay. We will move on to public comment, and I have received no public comment. So I think we'll move right along to the next item, which is new and continuing business. And the first item there is the fiscal year 20 audit review. And we received documents from Dr. Slaughter, and I am going to turn the next section over to him.
Okay. So this is the fiscal 20 audit, which, just to make sure that's the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2020, which is now more than a year ago. Traditionally, you would have this kind of review kind of December, January, probably. Usually the audit is done in the late fall and early winter, and then we have the report ready by January or so. With last year being what it was, that all got delayed. And so that's why we're doing this as late as we are. So it'll be interesting because we'll do it and then basically turn around and do it all again really, really soon. And from my office's standpoint, we've finished supplying things to the auditors, and then we're going to basically turn around in about 6 or 7 weeks and do it all again, if not sooner. So they'll kind of come back to back in that regard. So just to sort of take you through the 3 documents that I sent to you, there are really sort of 3 pieces there. One is a really short one, which has to do with the review of the end of year report. So the auditors take a look at the end of year report that we do with the state, and they look for anything that looks off relative to the other financial information they're looking at. They found a couple of things, so that's what those findings are. One of which is one I discovered when they were asking for things, and I was looking for that information and then looking at what I had reported to the state, and actually kind of simultaneously discovered they would have found it immediately as well, and recognized that I had needed to alter one of the entries. And then there was a subsequent one that they also noticed, and it mostly is having to do with the fact that this is my first time through this, and it's quite the process, to say the least. They weren't huge. They were not ones that were sort of materially worrisome, I think. It would be the best way to describe it. They were ones where we wanted to make a correction, and the state does allow us to make corrections to our submitted report for a rather extended period of time. But nonetheless, the corrections were made, and so that's the 2 findings that they had were ones that we corrected without issue. And I think the other thing that it states there, and one of the things I'll note about all 3 of those, is that the auditors spend a fair amount of time talking about what they do and what they don't do. They're very, very clear about the things that they can't determine. And I think part of the reason they do that is because I think people have an expectation that an audit is that they go through every single transaction, and it's not the case. They sample our data and test to a level of degree that they consider is sufficient to make a determination about how we're doing our business. So even with the end of year reports, the same sort of thing. They're doing a review of some. Probably the end of year report, they probably do a little more extensive because it's not quite as lengthy to look through that as the other parts of the financials. So they talk about what they can and can't do, what they are or are not going to do, or can make statements about or not make statements about. But I think the key things you want to look, sort of be aware of are the phrases, whether they consider the opinion to be modified or unmodified. And what that really says is that when they looked at the financial statements we gave them, they put it together. If they have to modify those to represent our financial picture accurately, that's a much more problematic. It's not, unheard of or anything like that, but it's always better to have an unmodified opinion, which means that they look through the financials and how they were structured and what they said to, to them and to the public at large is that that's a true picture of what happened with your finances in fiscal 20. The other things that you want to look for, I think that are sort of particularly of note are what they call material weaknesses or significant deficiencies. Because again, that's where they're using their, that's a bit of, auditor lingo, but at the same time, what that really is identifying is that when they went through things, if they found something that, would or could cause the financials that we're reporting to be inaccurate, whether they really did or didn't, if they were just such that they would potentially cause that, and especially if they were to potentially cause some inaccuracy and we wouldn't have a way to notice it. So a lot of times they talk about, the third thing they talk about is internal controls. And internal controls are basically your process, policies, and procedures that you follow. They compare those to, general accounting standards, and if they find something in your processes that would cause a material weakness or a significant deficiency, then those are things they're going to mention, they're going to call out, they're going to ask us to address and take corrective action on. And so those are things to those are phrases, anytime you look at an audit, whether it's ours or any other one that you might ever do, those are phrases that are pretty, pretty red flags, pretty much red flags if you do see them, because they indicate that, something could be going on that we wouldn't notice could be going on. In other words, there are things outside of our control in a way that would, we think our financials are one way when in reality there's something else. And so in looking through those, our finances, they didn't find any material weaknesses, they didn't find any significant deficiencies, which is always good news. We do want to know about something like that. If they have opportunity to find things that they feel could be done better, they will let us know. They didn't have any comments in that regard. And so that was also a bit of good news with regard to our audit. So those are the sort of overarching things I would say. The end of year report review, again, we do an audit because we're required by the state to do that. So the end of year report, we file one for each of the 3 districts. The region in particular, and actually Amherst and Pelham also had end of year report reviews by our auditors, just like the one you see here for the region. The second one is what's called a single audit, sometimes called a single audit or a government or federal funds audit. That's the medium-sized document of the 3. And what that is they look specifically at our grant funding like IDEA and Title I, and those grants, because we receive over $750,000 worth of federal monies, we're required to have that type of audit. And again, they're looking for the same kinds of processes and procedures that meet with general accounting standards and allow us to represent how we spent their money and on what accurately. And so again, the short story is that there were no findings, there were no material weaknesses or significant discrepancies or deficiencies in what they saw. And then the third piece, which is the big long one, which is I was looking at today and thinking, wow, there's a lot of filler here, but not really. I mean, it's actually, its intended audience is the public. And so therefore, that's why it goes into so much detail about how the retirement system works. It goes through how MTRS works. It goes through how the Hampshire County retirement works and what the options employees have. And it goes through OPEB in a fair amount of detail. So there's a lot of just additional information that they're providing along with the financial statements. And again, the fact that it was unmodified indicates that what we gave them and demonstrated as our financials for the district were an accurate representation of what really happened, which is good. That's what we want to say and what we want to see. They often comment about whether or not our policy procedures are effective. So they're not looking for, I mean, obviously if they find some sort of mistake or discrepancy, they'll point it out, but that's not their intent. What they're looking for is that if you're doing processes that will lead to accuracy in the whole, but they don't look for errors particularly. So it's kind of a funny thing with audits is you think they're going to find, oh, where you made a mistake or this, that, or the other. It really isn't. They're focusing on whether or not how you go about doing your business is in such a way that it would maintain the accuracy and fidelity of the numbers and represent what's going on financially for the district correctly. And so if there were something problematic, then it's likely that they would have then commented on something not adding up the way it should add up. And so that's, they didn't have any of that. So that's, again, a fortunate thing. The other couple things I'll point out is one of the big ones that you show on an audit in the financial statements is you have to represent your OPEB liability on your balance sheet, and that really it makes it look really bad. It looks like we're in the negative $70 million. And the other concern is when you compare from fiscal 19 to fiscal 20, there's a significant increase in that number. So first it's a large negative number because the liability or the money we will at some point in the future owe has to be sort of put onto your balance sheet. So they're basically saying you have to represent what your obligation is to all your current and existing retirees, your current employees and existing retirees. You have to represent that on your, because that's something you're going to have to pay at some point. So they're, probably 8 years ago or so, that became a standard to put that onto the balance sheet. So it made everybody's balance sheet go really negative because no one's got their retirement benefits funded fully. So that's one thing. The other thing is a bit concerning in looking at that number, is that it went up significantly from the previous year. And what that really is an indication of is how our evaluation changed. So every other year we do a full evaluation of what our liability is. In other words, what our future responsibility to retirees is around benefits. We do a full renewal of that every other year. In the off year, which is current fiscal 21, they make an estimate. So they do kind of a quick estimate of what that change has been. But one of the significant things between 2019, or more importantly 2018, when we had our last full one done, and 2020 when we had our more recent full analysis done, is who we had do that work is different. And they made some very different assumptions about how much health insurance costs are going to go up, how much return on investment we're going to have. And those two in particular were things that they did very differently than our previous actuarial who does that calculation. And so that made our OPEB liability go up significantly. The town had the same thing happen to them. So they were much more conservative in what they thought health insurance was going to do. In other words, they projected much higher health insurance costs over the next 30 years as they project out. They also projected more conservatively relative to what essentially what interest earning there's going to be. So as you put money away into our OPEB trust, that you get interest and then interest on your interest, and that helps to reduce your liability. And their estimate for what that return is on investment was more conservative, a much smaller number than the previous actuarial. So that those two things, how they go about doing the calculation, were pretty significantly different, and therefore made our OPEB liability go up quite a bit. So that's, it's the fortunate thing is we don't have to pay it today. So it's a number that's going to change a lot over the years, plus minus, as things go along. But it gives us a sense of how big that liability is, and a sense of the urgency to continue to fund our OPEB trust fund as we move along. So those are things that kind of jump out to me on the financial statements that I know them, but then you sort of see them in stark reality when they put it on paper like that. And so I want to explain that a little bit for you guys. But I was pleased, kind of going through this one for the first time. Fiscal 20 I only had a tiny part of that one as far as, being in this role, but and the full end of year responsibility and some of that. So I was pleased that they didn't have a lot of things that needed correction or things that they were worried about. That's really a testament to my predecessor and of course my staff and in the work that they do and how well they do their work. And so I'll ride their coattails on that for sure. So I think I'll stop there and ask if anybody has any questions as you went through and looked at that, anything that jumped out that you were like, what the heck is that? Or something that looked concerning or off-putting or not.
So does anyone have questions? I actually do have one question, Dr. Slaughter. So you said that they look at the full liability. How do they determine what the full liability is? Do they have some kind of actuarial formula for saying, this person may live this long and therefore require benefits?
That's exactly the kind of idea that they do. Yeah, they get a list of current retirees and a list of current employees, and they make estimates about how long people are going to live. How many are likely to become retirees for the current employees? How many are likely to become retirees? What their likely lifespan is like? What their likely health burden is going to be? So they make all those kind of estimates on that. They also, like I said, they estimate our trust fund and how well it'll grow or how quickly it'll grow or how strongly it'll grow. They will also estimate what they think is going to happen in the marketplace relative to cost of health insurance.
Okay.
So they use all of those things and as part and parcel, like it's a pretty extensive kind of thing to do. And it's funny that people will often, and kind of rightly so, look at that number and it's very scary, but and there's a lot of significant and thorough computations involved, but at the same time, there's a lot of estimates.
Okay.
They're rational and reasonable and appropriate, and it's what actuarials do all the time. That's how the whole insurance industry works. So, but yeah, they take into account all that sort of stuff.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments or? So I guess I have another question. So will you be presenting this to the full regional committee?
I will, and I think how we do that will be a little bit determined by how you want to do it. It could be a thing where I could do kind of like what I did now, except probably even more brief, hopefully. But if you would like to do that kind of introduction, it's perfectly fine too. I think it's up to you and the chair as to how you want to approach that. But I'm happy to sort of explain the terminology, which is really, I think, one of the biggest pieces is what are the terms that they're using, and what are the sort of key takeaways from what we've seen, and I can do that.
Okay.
As part of the.
Does anybody have any feedback about that? What you think we should do? Or what Dr. Slaughter should do? No?
Well, I think it's great that there weren't any important findings. So well done, Doug, and everybody else on your team. I think that should be, I think, one of the things strongly communicated to the committee and the public. I'm also, this OPEB number. So I think I'm I forget what my title is, but OPEB is I think I'm the one who signs the documents for OPEB and some of the payments. So if I remember correctly, we slowed down our contributions to OPEB to deal with some of the financial.
Right. We more conservatively
challenges we were facing. So
yeah, we were worried for fiscal 20. I've got to remember now. I think for fiscal 21, I think we went from 98,000 to 68,000. I think we reduced it. I think we brought it back up this year. I have to look. I haven't looked to see, but it is one of those things. The more aggressively we can put money away, the better. But obviously, it's it's like spending money on capital. It means you're not spending it on operating. So then you can't. There's sort of the balancing act between the here and now and the future, and trying to strike the right balance there. But
that's kind of my question. Is are we going to have to because it's changed. Like, I guess the concerning thing is that if it's a moving target, and if it just got harder to hit, are we going to have to take a hit in some other areas to address it, or are you not worried about it? I guess that's one of the things I'm curious about, if it's going to become an issue under already kind of tight financial.
Yeah, I don't think we need to take immediate action. I mean, I think it's a bit of a bellwether for the future. I think there's a couple of pieces. I would suggest that their estimate of health insurance costs were pretty conservative, maybe a bit too conservative. I don't think we'll see health insurance costs rise as much as they expect them to for us. So I think that's one differential I'll make in sort of how I would characterize that number. It's still a very big number. The other piece is that we've got time. So we but we do want to keep it in mind, keep working at it. Excuse me. The other thing I would say is that we're currently trying to fully fund our retirement. So the folks that pay into Hampshire County, that's a system they sort of, that one and that problem kicked in earlier. So in the mid 80s, the state required everybody to kind of make a plan for funding their retirees because they had done a kind of pay as you go on that. It was starting to chew up everybody's budgets. And so the payment we make to Hampshire County each year includes some sort of, one way to describe it is we're trying to catch up. So there's a when you're doing that kind of funding for a future retirement benefit, whether it be a pension or health insurance, there are estimates of what you need to put away sort of every year to sort of make sure it has enough when the group of current employees retires. But for our pension, we're doing that chunk plus some because we've got people who we didn't fund previously. And so we're still trying to get caught up. And when they talk about being fully funded, so before the Great Recession in 2008, the target was, I think, 2030. I think they've kicked that out for pensions to 2035 or something like that. They kind of extended the time horizon. And depending on how that retirement system performs, we may realize or get to a sort of a fully funded state sooner than that. When that happens, our assessment for Hampshire County and will drop significantly. So then we can just switch and use those resources to help fund our OPEB at that point. Things that would happen that would cause us to take a different strategy would be if we started having health insurance go up, 10, 12, 15% every year, and there wasn't anything we could do about it. I mean, we've had circumstances like that in the past. We've generally had things we could do with plan design and some of that sort of stuff to alter and sort of mitigate those cost increases. But you could be in a circumstance where that you don't have those options anymore. I think we're not in that place, and I don't foresee us being in that place. I think we've been pretty good about being attentive to our costs in a way that we shouldn't see that kind of sharp spike. If we had a really sharp spike in health insurance costs, then that would change the conversation considerably, because what we would find is that the chunk of the budget that goes to benefits, in particular for retirees, would become much, much larger and really eat into our ability to operate our schools. So I don't foresee that happening. So I think we've got some time. It is disconcerting to see a big jump of $14 million in what we think we owe, but I think we don't want to explain it away. We don't want to minimize the need and the need to continue to address it. But I think it also indicates, you can just see how the difference in going from one actuarial to another can make a huge, huge difference in what that number looks like. And so it's important to kind of keep an eye on it, and as we go through the years to try to shrink it or to try to have it be working in a direction where we fund more fully and have that number start to come down and not have the big jumps like that. But I think changing actuarials makes a big difference. And that's not to say they're good or bad. It's just a much different set of assumptions, and so. But it also indicates how how volatile it can be and how much it can change. But fortunately, we're not going to suddenly stop and everybody retire tomorrow. So we don't have to come out with all the money right now. So that's good.
Any other comments or questions at this point? Actually, I do have a question. Dr. Slaughter, is the Hampshire County retirement, is that what all of the teachers and the staff are part of? Is that their retirement plan?
So teachers and administrators all pay into the MTRS, which is Massachusetts Teacher Retirement System, which is its own system. But everyone else, all the custodians, clerical, paraprofessionals, those are, the folks that pay into the Hampshire County, along with the municipal employees at the town hall and that sort of thing. And so it's roughly half and half into the two systems. They're very parallel in a lot of ways. The state teachers retirement system, I think, is a little more mature in some respects. But it's, the concept is the same in both cases.
All right, thank you. That's helpful to understand that for me. All right, well, I guess if there are no more comments or questions, thank you, Dr. Slaughter, for that. I learned a lot listening to this tonight, so thank you. So we'll move on to the next topic on the agenda, which is the school budget basics for the public. And as those of us who were at the regional school committee retreat know, the budget, this is something that came up during that time. And I guess the thing maybe to do, Ms. McDonald shared a couple of documents with them. One of them was the notes from the retreat regarding the budget, things related to the budget, which Ms. Lord prepared the notes from our meeting. And the other is a document that she shared with some suggestions about how to proceed with this particular item. So I guess what would be appropriate for tonight is to perhaps discuss, I think, Ms. McDonald's document and the suggestions that she makes in there and see how people feel about that. Does that seem reasonable to everybody? Dr. Slaughter?
So when we last met as a subcommittee, we had been talking about this topic about how to present things to the public generally. What are good ways to do that? And we were, I think, a bit in the throes of budget, so it's a little difficult to sort of really spend some time on it. But so that's part of why I wanted to put it on the agenda tonight, is because there have been subsequent conversations, not really knowing that you guys had talked about it at the retreat, but knowing that the superintendent, myself, and Ms. McDonald had a conversation regarding thinking about how do we outreach sooner and sort of build some knowledge base and awareness in the public about how we go about what we do and what all is involved in getting the budget constructed, so that people, if they want to sort of impact the budget, when's the right time to engage, I think, is one of the things that I think, and this has been true. I've been in town meeting and on around budgets, not just school budgets, for a long time, and one of the struggles that most folks have is that the budget starts way earlier than anybody knows, unless you're in it for a while. And so to impact a budget, you really have to have that conversation essentially this fall, because once we kind of turn the corner of the year, the realities of what finances are available, what resources are available, start to hit, and it's really difficult to make any sort of major shifts in how you're thinking about spending your money at that point. So, that's a piece I think that the public generally it's hard to pay attention 9 months early, right? Because that's
Yeah.
really what it goes down to. It's like we're going to talk in October about something that takes in effect the following July.
Yes.
So it's the other thing I would suggest is that it's really complex, and I think that's one of the other things to convey to people is that in as much as some aspects are fairly straightforward, there's like so much revenue and so much expenses, and you can't have more expenses than revenue, right? But the number and types and constraints on the different revenue sources and expenditures, gets really complex really quickly when you talk about like assessment methods and Chapter 70 formulas and all that sort of stuff. And I think that tends to numb people a little bit because it starts to they get out of their depth and they get uncomfortable and so I think it's imperative. I mean, this is my opinion, so I'll share it with you, and you guys can go from there. Is that it's imperative to kind of keep the basic through line of the conversation always in a frame that anybody can access. And so, when we get into talking the specifics of assessment methods or, capital funding or, whatever it is, I think it's always good to have that sort of touchstone that most people can kind of come back to and understand broadly what's happening, and because the details get really nuanced really quickly and really difficult. And you can talk to business officials around the state, and there are aspects, and I'll admit to this myself. I mean, there are aspects of some of the things that I don't know exactly. Partly because they don't come up for us. I mean, that's part of it. The things that just don't come up in our circumstance, and yet, but there are also just subtleties of things that I invariably am going and looking up the details on just to make sure that we sort of execute the right steps to sort of get the funding right or get the projection made properly, or make it a reasonable estimate about how this, that, or the other thing is going to be funded or not funded. So it gets really complex really quick. So I think it's helpful for us to keep in mind that it's that complex, and that we want to have a way to kind of come back to touchstones that are broadly accessible for people to kind of keep the conversation where it needs to be, which is about what's really important to us, where do we want to spend our money in the broadest sense, and how do we have those conversations, which are ones that we can all have and the public can have and can be meaningful, and so I'll say that and stop there.
Okay. I assume you looked at the document that Ms. McDonald shared.
I did.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm not quite sure where to go from here. I guess I'll ask for comments from either Ms. Lord or Ms. Spitzer. If you have any thoughts about the timeline or that she's suggesting, the kinds of things that are suggested in there. I think they fit into keeping Dr. Slaughter's comment in mind about how complex it gets. I still think that we can do more with the public about how the budget happens, starting early, trying to get input from people about what they feel is most important, those kinds of things. So, and timing is important because of the budget process starting so early. Any comments? Ms. Spitzer?
Thanks. So I think this is useful to have this document, and I apologize, I came in this today, so I didn't have I'm just reading it now and reacting to it, so I'm not fully formed. But a couple questions I had kind of for Doug is what pieces of this are we already maybe not doing because I know it's been hard. You've been starting in a time of COVID and a pandemic, and I know but I feel like some of this stuff was getting done in years that were non-pandemic years, in terms of some of the reports that we put together for the two, like those big budget books we had, I feel like some of the bullets under the ideas might at least intersect or overlap a bit with some of the work that's already ideally getting done in a regular year. And then my other question was this idea of, I'm curious about when it says possible timing, like considers regional budget process advisory committee, like how is that going to be different than the budget subcommittee? I've been hearing a lot of feedback from folks that they don't want to commit to additional subcommittees at the last, like I think we heard that somewhat in the meeting. So I'm curious about how is this a separate committee? And if so, how would its task be distinct from the budget subcommittee? Would it have members from outside of the school committee? And is that what makes it different, is maybe we'd bring in folks who are constituents rather than just members of the administration and the school committee? So those were my initial questions, but I think it's a really great idea to start trying to bring in town officials who are part of this process, where, especially at the region, because I think the more information they have and the better understanding, hopefully the more smoothly the process will go.
If I could just offer one quick thing. Yeah, I mean, my goal this year, certainly for a number of reasons, is to get back to some of the things. So like we, traditionally published a timeline of when we were looking to meet and, when the decision points were, I'd like to get back to doing that and making that a more public document, getting that. I think there are some opportunities to put that more clearly on our website. I think the sort of big budget books, I mean, there are aspects of that not having had an opportunity to really build them, it's been unfortunate because they do help answer a lot of questions for folks. And I think getting back to that is helpful. I do think they are an overwhelming document because they're usually a couple hundred pages and people, start to get trepidation about opening something that large. But at the same time, I'd like to do that independently, just so that whether the public leverages it much or not, but for for the school committee's sake as well as my own and really quite honestly my the staff and principals and administrators, those are really useful tools for them as well. And so it's certainly a goal of mine to get back to that and many of the other things we've done in the past to help paint the picture. Do I think there are ways we could to update our website or make things a little more easy to find, but also visually simpler? I think there are aspects of that budget book that are a little, I mean, the text is great, but I think it's oftentimes a little overwhelming to kind of get through all of that. And so I want to do some thinking about some simplified versions of some of that same information so that it's a little more hands-on. I was talking to Sean Mangano probably 2 years ago about this thing. He goes, yeah, I'd like to have one of those pictures with like a dollar bill that like the slices of the bill represent the pieces. Because that, when you think about $1, people can, get their heads wrapped around, 50 cents is spent on this and 12 cents is spent on that. And I appreciate that. Pie chart does the same thing. It's just not always as tangible when you sort of lay out a dollar bill and say, okay, well, this much of it's for this and this is for this and this is for this. That gets a little more digestible in some ways. So I think there's a few different ways we can approach that. Relative to the other topic, which you asked about the advisory committee, I'm going to defer on that. Let maybe the Chair McDonald weigh in on that a little bit more, or the rest of you, because I don't have an opinion. I mean, I have some opinions, but it's not my purview, I guess.
So I'm going to call on Ms. McDonald, even though she's not a member of the budget committee. I'm still going to call on her because she has presented this information to us. Ms. McDonald.
Thank you. So I just want to answer the thought, just to start as a starting point. This was the intent of this is not to prescribe what we should be doing. It's really just from conversations, just encapsulating all of them in one spot, because I think that's easier than having sort of abstract conversations. It's easier for us to look at like words on page and be like, oh, no, that's not what I want. That's not what makes sense. So none of this, it really is just a starter for conversation. And the advisory committee, again, I'm not sure on this, but there's conversations, and I think, conversations that I've been having with folks from the town council, for example, and just remembering our Four Towns process last year, that there's a desire to, or just a energy, maybe is a word. I don't even know if it's a full form desire, but to think about the process, and in a way that sort of brings the groups together and brings our member towns together in the region in a different way than, I shouldn't say different, in a way that is as collaborative and open in working on the budget, and sort of not sort of getting to it. I think, when did we have it? Was it February? I think there was some sentiment that was so late in the process, for some things to begin to be discussed. And so this was a thought, to create a way to sort of create a committee to talk about that process and the process only, sort of to collaborate across the towns before we get to the actual Four Towns meeting. I know that there's significant downsides to this idea, not least of which is it's more committee meetings, and ensuring that the right members from the member towns are involved, and I shouldn't even say the right enough is probably more the right word. Defining the scope narrowly enough so that it isn't creeping into the role of the actual Four Towns meeting. I mean, I'm sure Doug has lots of other sort of potential downside perspective on it. So I'm not thinking that that's what we would do. It was just a sort of an idea of how do we build a more collaborative process, around sort of the Four Towns meetings that can work, and has worked. So I guess that's really the question there.
Thank you. Ms. Lord, do you have any observations or comments? All right. Well, I guess I had hearing Ms. McDonald's comments and looking at this, I wonder if we could think about, if there's going to be an advisory committee, I guess my opinion, my feeling is that would have more to do with, it sounds like what you were thinking, Ms. McDonald, of getting the town people together earlier in the process. I think that some of this work is really work that the budget subcommittee should probably do, not an advisory committee. I think, if we're going to try and prepare some information for the public where maybe we can define some of the things in a way that might be easier to understand, keeping it general enough that, we don't get people down in the rabbit hole, but keep them general enough. I think that might be the role of the budget committee too. So I wonder, I don't know, anybody else want to comment on that? I can see a role for an advisory committee if we want to bring other people in from outside at some point in the budget process. Ms. Mitzer.
I guess I'm just trying to understand, is the idea to bring folks in earlier so they understand how we got to the numbers we got to? Is it an edge, trying to help them understand our constraints, or the values that led to those numbers, or is it more? Because I think the thing I'm worried about is it going to be a meeting where we're trying to get that information so that the district changes what it's spending its money. Is it supposed to have any impact on how we actually are spending the dollars, or is it all about trying to get them get a baseline understanding of the process so that hopefully the meeting will be a little more harmonious. Because I guess I'm a little worried if it's that one of educational piece, or is it more about like participatory budgeting so that they're having more say in how we're spending the dollars. Because I think we're all elected officials from the 4 towns that are represented, and that is kind of our role. And so if it's, I'd hope it would be more the educational piece.
Dr. Slaughter?
If I may, I think there's sort of 2 pieces here, I think, in the broadest sense. I mean, I think there is, opportunity for, let me back up a step. So traditionally at a 4 towns meeting, it was, here's some information about how we're thinking about our program of studies and that sort of thing. And obviously comments could be made as to whether, the select board in Leverett or Tewksbury likes it or doesn't like it, but that's more critically the school committee member from that town's responsibility to sort of weigh in on that in regional school committee meetings as we do our budget. I always have sort of envisioned the 4 towns meeting as a conversation about sort of ability to pay and capacity to pay. One of the struggles we've had more recently is about the mechanisms of how the assessment's done, because there are sort of multiples. It's a longstanding and ongoing issue. So I think that my thinking is the following: is that, I mean, obviously, they can offer, any of the 4 towns and their members can offer suggestion about, we think you should spend more on this, the Bright program or this, or that. But that would be something they could do through the regular sort of budget hearings and process that happens. I think that, there's an education piece about how the assessments work and how, the different methodologies impact how much a particular town pays, independent of what that, sort of target is, but just sort of, what is the burden that's borne by each town, what are the mechanics of that, what influences it, what impacts it, what doesn't impact it. I think that's an educational piece we can do. And then the second piece is then to have those conversations that we've had, but in more of a tangential way, which is, how do we get to a place where, some very differing philosophies about how that, sort of cost should be borne. And I think that, knowing the tools we have and the mechanics we have, one piece, but then the second piece is, how do we productively work to a place of agreement, a compromise, that is palatable and understood. And I think that's the area that's been more of the struggle for us in the last, few years. And I mean, it's always been there in some respects. I think it's more strident of late because I think that there are, some, there are different pressures in different towns. The 3 smaller towns, really in some ways have the same kinds of pressures in that, their ability to raise taxes and the costs aren't in sync, and differing views within the community about, what's a fair way to divvy up that cost. And so, I think thinking about ways we could engage that conversation about how to balance those different points of view, because I think that it's been clear the last couple of times that I've been involved that there's a very stridently different point of view about a full statutory method versus a full regional assessment, regional agreement method, and the varying flavors in between that. And I think that, and one of the other things that's really a significant difficulty is with Amherst being so large, how that impacts things, good and bad. If Amherst has a great year financially, its ability to sort of have a huge positive impact on the finances of the region is pretty significant. Whereas if Leverett has a great year and they want to go up 5%, Amherst may only be able to go 1%. That's, there's a huge, difference there. And so understanding that and how those interact is also part and parcel of that conversation about how to strike that compromise. And I think that's the real, sort of there's learning the mechanics of how it fits together and what's at play between the sort of two primary tools we have, which is a statutory method or a rolling average method. We can invent an entirely new one if we wanted to go there. But then I think the second is how do we, get participation and find common ground about where we land relative to that and where we see ourselves in the future too, I think, which is also hard. Communities are facing the Prop 2.5 limits of $25 per $1,000 evaluations. Once that hits, you're stuck. You don't really have an option to go above that, and that's going to create some crisis in a number of communities around the Commonwealth, not just ours, but I think that's coming in the next 3 to 5 years, maybe not quite that quickly, depending. That's going to change the conversation in I think, because the ability of towns to take action is going to change. They're going to have less tools at their disposal.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's kind of how I see it. I think keeping ourselves focused on those kind of two aspects would be perhaps most productive, and can be started. In some ways it can start tomorrow. I don't. Those are not things that need to know what the estimated revenue needs to be for fiscal 23.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in some ways in some ways to have those conversations, having using a generic number as the target, and then talking about how those different mechanisms of assessment method and that sort of thing play into that might be valuable because it abstracts it from the immediacy of the coming budget. And so that might be a way to have the conversation about the mechanics. It's one of the things I think we really need to have, without it getting quite so tied to the specific, more personal things of how does school work next year and what's involved and what's not going to be there next year or whatever it is. So, it's long-winded, sorry, but
It's good.
I've sat in both sides of this, over the years. So I've thought about it quite a bit in some ways.
So it seems to me like we're really looking at two pieces on this. Both have some educational component to them. We're looking at the assessment method process, and we're looking at how the budget gets created and what perhaps defining some of the things for people in a more general way about, special education, regional transportation, those kinds of things in that affect the revenue and also some of our expenditures. So I don't know, it seems to me like we're really looking at two parts to this. And I might suggest that the budget subcommittee would continue working on some of the part, not the assessment method part initially, but how do we talk to the public about the budget process when it starts, how, what the parts of it are. And then maybe we have an advisory committee that kicks in that might that deals more with the assessment issues, and that might bring in a couple of people from outside, maybe a person from each of the towns somehow. Anybody want to comment on that? No?
Sorry.
Yes,
I'm
sir.
just, so bringing in the folks from the towns, would we be bringing them into this committee that we're proposing? I'm sorry, it's around dinner time and I'm getting, my hunger is getting in the way of my ability to process. So could you just restate the last bit about bringing in members from the town and what we'd be doing?
I guess I wonder if we were going to have at a point, some point, if there were going to be an advisory committee that was going to deal more specifically with the assessment part of it, as opposed to the budget process part. I guess that's what I'm suggesting. And if it were an advisory committee, if we wanted to, that means we could bring in outside people. We wouldn't have to, but it would mean that you could.
So
Go ahead.
I'm just trying to connect this to the work that was done previously on, like, wasn't there this entire assessment working group that tried to get to a new method? And so we wouldn't be trying to find a new method. We'd be trying to educate about what we're currently doing, or would the goal be to try to come, because I feel like there's the bringing together and sometimes and sorry to be negative about this, it's just, but it does feel like there are some fundamental conflicts that are not going to be easily addressed because of, these structural issues that the school committee doesn't have any ability to really fix on its own and are not going away, as was mentioned. So would the convening be to try to just get people to understand that we actually don't have this is the statutory method, this is the regulatory method, this is what how we've been muddling through for the past few years? Or is there some sort of goal of actually trying to amend that process and get to a more consistent way of figuring out?
I can only tell you, I guess, what my opinion is from the conversations that we've been having, is it wouldn't be looking at trying to create a new assessment method. You want to comment on that, Dr. Slaughter?
I can. I think that, the state definitely would prefer us not to have a different method every year. I think that, and I think that what their concern is, or what they think about is, it becomes more difficult to be planful if you're always sort of moving changing the rules of the game. And I think that's hard for our communities to be able to evaluate the method as well. And so I think that, I don't know that there's a particular outcome that we would necessarily be able to get to, in what would make my life a little easier, because it's all about me. Is that if we could get an agreement on a particular assessment method for a few years, I think that, then if everybody's like, all right, we're going to do this, and this is how we're going to do it, this methodology, whatever that, is some variant on what we've done in the past few years, and just hold it steady for a couple of years, I think then that we can see how that plays out over a couple of years, which I think is also instructive to the communities as to how a consistent method kind of plays out. But I do think that there's, and I think this happens within communities as well as across communities, that, fuller understanding of what are the pressures, the financial pressures. Because I think that, if you go to, within Amherst, certainly, and I think it's true in all of the other towns, it's like, and you spoke to 20 people in each of those, you might get very different opinions about where they think the stress points are. And it's not that they're inaccurate, they just may, their view of how important something is versus another and that sort of thing. So I think that's a piece I think we have to, that I think would be valuable to explore, and to have the time to explore and have each community understand their own sort of mechanics of finance and constraint, and as well as the other, 3 communities. And then I think that gets us in a place where we might be able to have a way to find a more permanent solution to an assessment method. But, which is part of why the state came up with the statutory method. There's things I like about it, there's things I dislike about it. One of the pieces that one of the communities likes to talk about a lot is that it includes income. And my counter, which is great, I think that's not a bad thing to factor that in. But my counter argument is that, well, yeah, but a local community doesn't get a tax on income; they can only tax on property value. So it's yeah, if you have people who have a lot of income, then you potentially can have them pay more, but and they would be willing to pay more for their schools. However, you're still limited by $25 per thousand. So there's a limit to how far that can go. So there's plus and minuses to to any method we have, and so I think it's going to be difficult. But if we could, in the shorter term, come to some agreement about an assessment that we could hold steady for a few years, I think that would be a really big win for everybody, and we could all take a collective deep breath and then kind of continue to understand the difficulties we all have internally and externally, and how to maybe get to an assessment method that we can get to more permanently.
Ms. Spitzer?
I like the idea of getting to something consistent, and I guess I'm wondering if the school committee is the one to convene this working group, just because it is such a contentious issue. Is there any, and was the assessment working group prior convened by kind of an outside party or a figure that was, I don't know, it's just a thought I have in terms of maybe being able to break down some of the barriers to good communication might be having a third party who's not the school committee trying to navigate these. I don't know, just a thought.
I don't know the history of a previous working group. Do you, Dr. Slaughter?
So I think that there's, I don't know if it was, formally, school committee that necessarily convened it. It was clear in I think the way the previous working groups, and there's been a few, have been started was ostensibly through school committee saying we'd like to do this, in communities then offering people to participate. To be honest, I think sometimes the people that have been in my role have asked for it. So I think it's been kind of this organic process that it's happened in some ways. I mean, I think the more recent ones have been more formally. The regional school committee said, hey, let's put this group together. Can you offer a few members that can participate in an active way? But I think that how that charge would be written would be could be a very helpful thing if done critically, I guess. And the school committee could take a different tack than they have in the past. And that's not a criticism. It's just it might be necessary to take a different approach to frame the work. Because I think we've taken, we've hired a consultant, so it's an outside person to come in and talk about, different methodologies and how they play out in each of the towns. And that's helpful and useful, but I'm not sure the mechanics is where we need the consultant help. If we were going to have that, I think there are other sort of mediation skills that might be better. But I'm not 100% certain. But certainly I think that it's kind of been driven by the school committee saying, hey, why don't we form this group to talk about this? People have been, the membership of the school committee are hearing from their town officials that, like, hey, we should have this conversation. And so I think it's kind of somewhat organically, but somewhat directively through school committee happened in the past.
Well, it's 7. It's actually a few minutes past 7. I don't know that we've really gotten exactly to a place.
So if I could,
yeah.
I'll offer a couple things. So I'll say that I'm hearing a few directives from the group about things that we can do. And so we'll talk, sort of the small bite-sized things or well-defined things. So, I think around sort of broader educational sort of stuff, getting back to a budget book and a timeline that's more easily,
Mhm.
that exists and are more easily on our website. I think having other documents, not the full budget book, but other documents, and both specific to the upcoming budget, but also generally about the budgets. I think building some of those kinds of materials for folks are all things that myself and folks in my office can kind of put together and then give to you guys for feedback on. Those are going to be useful and powerful and helpful, perhaps more explicitly in the conversation about fiscal 23, but at the same time, I think they're going to help this broader conversation we're having. I think on that sort of broader topic, I think there's some educational things we can put together around, assessments and constructs and that are kind of things we talked about before, but we can be, perhaps present them in a way that's a little more digestible. I've been thinking about that a little bit over the last year or so. The other thing I would suggest is a sort of takeaway that you may want to discuss at the regional school committee is whether or not the members of the school committee want to go back to their towns and do some work in the town to sort of sit with their finance committees and their select boards to articulate, here's the things we are, thinking about, concerned about, constraints we're operating under, things we think are important or not important in our community as we build our budget, this being one part of it. That might be a useful first step for starting to get at that other kind of question, is this to sort of in a parallel to, Ms. McDonald sort of putting together this list of, things that have been discussed by making a sort of concrete document that we can look at and react to, is often very, very productive. And so I think if it might be worthwhile to have, the members reach out within their own communities to sort of try to elicit from those folks in their community with those things that are top of mind relative to, assessments and their financial constraints and some of that. So it's, some of it's going to be things that the town administrators are going to be able to sort of articulate fairly clearly, or your finance committees are going to say, hey, these are things that are coming up that we know we have, good, bad, or otherwise, that are in her, our horizon, or they could say things like, well, our community, really values having, X% of the budget for contingency, or our community really values if we have excess in our savings to essentially lower our tax rate. I was in a town meeting, I can't remember which one it was, but they literally took money out of their savings and in order to lower their tax rate for the coming year. That's a strategy you can use. Other communities don't do that. They're like, no, we've got this in the bank, we're going to use it for capital expense or whatever. So there's different strategies there. So I think there's, what I would suggest as far as moving ahead is I've got a bullet list of things from that list that I think are all going to be things we're working on and then I want to work on. But I would suggest maybe a conversation at your at a soon regional school committee meeting about kind of eliciting from the town sort of their worries, concern, constraints, et cetera, that kind of helps sort of build this frame of specifics, which I think is, we've often talked in more generalities, I think. And so I think getting more concrete with some of those discomforts in each town or around their finances and that sort of thing would be helpful. It'd certainly be helpful for me, but I think it would be helpful for the conversation amongst the 4 towns to be more explicit about what's driving their thinking.
I think that sounds like an excellent idea. It would be a way to involve them early, and the idea that we are actually reaching out to them to understand more about their situations. And in addition to helping us, I think that might be a good thing to do. So, okay, I'm going to make a suggestion, see what you all think. I'd like, if it's okay, Dr. Slaughter, to maybe have a conversation with you and to write up some of the notes from tonight that we can bring to the next regional committee meeting, which is next week. And I'll loop you all in along with Ms. McDonald, since she's the chair of the regional committee. Does that sound reasonable to people? I would send something out before the meeting so everybody can have a look at it. Does that sound reasonable? Dr. Slaughter, does that seem reasonable to you?
It sounds fine to me. I think,
You have time? I know.
yes and no is, I guess, the answer to that question. It's always yes and no. There's no shortage of things to do. So but if this is of importance, then it obviously sort of takes some precedent there. And I think the other, I think it's key that Ms. McDonald is willing to put it on the agenda, so that because she's going to have to put that on or amend it, basically sometime between today and tomorrow. As far as, but the topic can be broad, but it does, it will need to be formally on the agenda.
Okay, so we'll need to communicate very quickly.
Yeah. If we don't have things together until Tuesday, that's a different story, but.
Right, but to at least get something on the agenda so there's a placeholder.
Right.
We're meeting on Wednesday, actually, next week because of Rosh Hashanah.
Right.
Okay.
But
So
because of a holiday on Monday, we have to post tomorrow.
Right.
So.
Okay. All right. So that sounds like maybe the next thing that we do. That's okay with everybody? I'm seeing nodding heads. Okay. All right. Thank you. Again, I'm learning a lot, which is really good. So I guess I'll take a motion to adjourn.
I move to adjourn the Amherst Regional Budget Subcommittee.
Thank you. All in favor? Miss Lord?
Lord, aye.
Miss Bitzer?
Spitzer, aye.
And Stancer, aye. And thank you, everybody. Have a good
Thank you all.
evening.
I'll look for emails from you.
Good night.
Okay.